Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Mark Schroeder, who's Professor of Philosophy at the University of Southern California. He's interested in the ways in which rationality, reasons, value, and other evaluative and normative categories are related to the mundane physical world in which we live, in which things are round, red, or left of one another. Welcome, Mark.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Yes, I want to start with one of your essays, Persons as Things. You say we are biological creatures, things of flesh and blood, whose behavior is governed by the same principles that govern the behavior of any other social mammals, plus or minus the complications that come from the recursive possibilities of access to natural language. That much is a fact. I have to warn you, Mark, I have no philosophy bone in my body. And
that's okay.
The conversation will be interesting. To make matters worse, I'm in the business of making people less relevant, in essence, replacing people with machines. And so in that context, it's an interesting thing to think about. So suppose we have a machine that replaces a person. We would think the machine is a thing. And if the machine is a thing, then the person is also a thing.
Yeah, there's a sense in which that's true.
Or if the person is not a thing, then one has to argue that the machine is not a thing either, right? And so
if the machine has fully replaced the person, yeah.
Fully replaced the person. So what are the implications of the essay, Persons as Things?
Yeah, so it's ultimately one of the central questions of philosophy, how we fit our lived experience into the world as revealed to us by science and experience. And there's something about being the business of replacing persons by machines that can make us all wonder, can I really be replaced by a machine? It's one thing to know that everything that you do is the result of lots of smaller and easier to understand processes that can be built up. And it's another thing to look at the machine that's replaced you and feel as important as you used to feel before that machine came along to replace you, right?
Right.
I got into this topic not because my philosophical research was originally about the relationship between persons and things, but rather because my wife and I were living in Santa Barbara, which is about 100 miles away from the University of Southern California, where I teach.
Yeah.
And she was doing her surgical residency, working about 80 to 100 hours every week. And we started expecting our first child. And we sat down in the evening, we thought to ourselves, how are we going to raise a child whose mother is working 100 hours a week and whose father is commuting 100 miles each way to and from work? And my mother-in-law came through, and she moved in with us for a year to take care of our daughter, Caroline. And so I spent a year living with her, with my in-laws. And so ever since then, I've been thinking a little bit about interpersonal conflict because of that experience. And so what happened is I read a very important philosophy paper by the philosopher Ray Langton. And it really helped me understand something about the relationship between myself and my mother-in-law that I was having a really hard time understanding while we were in that experience.
Yeah.
And that has to do with how we understand each other and why it is that we can sometimes feel bad about the way that other people are treating us. And there's a particular way of feeling bad about the way that somebody else treats you, where you feel like you're not being taken seriously.
Right.
You feel like you're being written off or ignored, or like you don't matter to the other person who you think that you ought to matter to, because they're your friend or your spouse or your parent or your child or your colleague or somebody that you have a relationship with. And that's really that feeling of being let down or dismissed is the feeling that I was trying to understand in this paper. And the way I think about it now, a couple of years after writing that paper, is that there are a lot of things that we want to understand about the relationships that we have with other people.
Yeah.
But interpersonal relationships are, by definition, relationships between persons, between people. And so if we want to understand what's special about them, we have to understand what's special or distinctive about being a person. And so whatever that is, that's special about persons, understanding it, I think, is going to be really important in order to understand how we feel about our interpersonal relationships and how they can give rise to distinctive kinds of conflict, and which ways of treating each other are involve the kind of respect that we sometimes think that people deserve and that we feel like we're missing when we feel like we're written off by somebody else.
So Mark, being a person, it's not necessarily a set of universal features or attributes, I would think, right? Each person presumably has a definition of himself or herself that cannot be fully articulated to an onlooker, right? I mean, it's impossible to fully reveal what you believe you are, right?
I think that's right. I think that our conceptions of ourselves are more detailed and fine-grained than we'd be able to write down. In fact, that once we wrote it down, then there'd be new true things about us that would reveal about us. And we'd probably change the act of trying to write it down. So I do think that self-understanding, that what you said, that self-understanding can be elusive, and that could be one of the things that creates distance between us, that we never perfectly understand each other in that way.
Yeah, so two issues I see. One is, do we understand ourselves perfectly well? Maybe not. And then if we don't do that, then your chance of understanding somebody else dramatically decreases, right? I mean, you have a lot more information on yourself, and you say, after having seen all that, you still don't understand yourself. Then it's nearly impossible for a person to understand another person.
Yeah, I think that's right. So one of the things that's very important to me is to push back against the idea that each of us has a privileged way of understanding ourselves. I think there's something that is sort of a product of, post-Enlightenment liberalism, that we think that respecting other people requires respecting their own interpretation of themselves. And then we think that each person's an authority and we should trust them. And it's paternalistic or interfering to act like we have a better idea about what's best for somebody than their own idea. But I think that this is really a mistake. I think that each of us can be mistaken about ourselves. And that part of why we know that's true is the very simple fact that sometimes we find out that we were wrong about ourselves in the past.
Right.
So, for example, I might wake up one day and I have some, tragic experience. Maybe I have an injury and I'm no longer able to pursue my career that I intended, playing the flute. And so all my years that I went into studying the flute and practicing for 12 hours a day at music school have all come to nothing. And I had this idea of who I was, that I was this person on my way to being, first chair flute in the New York Philharmonic or something. And in fact, I realized I was totally wrong. That's not who I was. I was somebody else. And I have to figure out who that is and what that is. Or we could find out that a relationship that we thought was important and meaningful to us was in fact not what we thought it was at all, because the other person has 2 other families somewhere else that they were hiding from us. And when we discovered that we were wrong about who we were, that shows us that we might still be wrong about who we are in some other way. And so I think that it can't be that we're always right about ourselves. But I agree with you that if we're not always right about ourselves, we're even less often going to be right about other people. But since they might not always be right about themselves,
right?
Even though it's easier to be right about yourself than to be right about other people, it doesn't follow that we have to always respect what they think about themselves. Sometimes we might be right and they might be wrong. That's possible.
Yeah. So the other thing I was thinking about, Mark, as you were talking, is that it also takes us a long time. Something similar happened to me in my professional career. I became an engineer, but I never really liked engineering, as an example.
Mm-hmm.
But we are spending 5, 6, 7 years before we realize that is not what you are. And so that feels like a very long time. Is it a problem with the processes that we deploy in analyzing ourselves, or we sort of don't think about it? But what is causing us to miss what we really are?
Well, I think a number of things can cause us to miss what we really are. Sometimes it's because we're looking for something else.
Yeah.
That we hope we're one kind of thing, that our story goes one way. And in fact, that wasn't a good thing to hope for. We only found out that it wasn't a good thing to hope for later. And once we stop hoping for it, that helps us see. Sometimes I think it can actually be because who we are is shaped by what happens to us. And so if you think of living your life as a little bit like writing a novel, and you have to write the chapters in order. So you write the first chapter and you have an idea of how it's going to go. But what you really want to do is you want to give your later self good material. And it could be that you'll end up with a better novel than the one you thought you were writing. And that'll be fine if you end up with a better novel than you thought you were writing. It's just that you didn't see yet how to make it better when you started at the beginning. So I think that there are different ways in which we might lack this knowledge early on. But it's just a thing that's very hard to have perfect knowledge about. And we know from other fields that when something's not transparent, the best we can do is to test for it. And any test that we have is going to err in some ways. And we have to learn to live with those kinds of errors.
Yeah, so what you mentioned before is very interesting, Mark. So you said, if I understood it correctly, in some situations, you might be in a better position to understand another individual than that individual himself or herself. Now, we have enough evidence that there are, errors or difficulty in understanding oneself. And so it makes sense that somebody else could understand you better than you are, better than you yourself could.
Definitely. So let me give a trivial example. Yesterday, I was trying to install a new set of sconces in our bedroom that my wife had purchased. And I wanted to do something else for the day. I wanted to prepare for my teaching for the semester. My wife wanted me to do the electrical work for these lights. And everything didn't go the way that I hoped. I punctured one of the wires and created a short, and my circuit breaker was tripping, and my daughter was wanting to use something that recorded electricity and kept asking me when it would be ready. And I started snapping at my daughter, and I felt like it was really important that people give me space and respect the time it was going to take me to solve this electrical problem. But my wife and my daughter, they understood better than me at the moment that I was just really crabby. I hadn't gotten enough sleep. I got up early in the morning to do this. It wasn't what I'd wanted to do. And it felt to me like what I was saying to them and how I was saying it was really important, and that they really needed to listen to me. And that's the way it felt to me at the time. But they could see that I needed to have lunch. Maybe they didn't offer me a Snickers bar, but maybe they should have. So I think that we, in a way, do this all the time, is that in the moment, you can be caught up in feeling very strongly about something.
Yeah.
And yet, when you look back on it later, you will see, oh, I was tired, or I was hungry, or I was displacing from something else. And since we can do it when we look back, we can also do it third person, at somebody else. And so it's not going to be perfect. We can go wrong. We can screw it up, and bad things can happen when we screw it up. But we can do it.
Yeah, there is a hypothesis, Mark, that the human brain will not be able to understand itself. It's sort of analogous to your novel writing example, that as you write new pages, you are changing yourself.
Exactly.
And so any process that has an ex ante expectation of understanding yourself cannot succeed, because the next step you have changed the object itself.
That's right.
And so understanding is, always, it's always going to be impossible.
But the effort to understand can be one of the really meaningful ways in which we shape and lead our lives. Often when we decide what we're going to do, often I think we make decisions that fit with our existing understanding of how it's going. Yeah. Just like if I'm writing a novel and I get to chapter 3, I'm going to write the chapter 3 that fits with the story that I think I'm telling, because that's how I think I need to get to chapter 7, where I'm going. Even if by the time I get to chapter 7, I have realized a better way for it to go. Right. So just like when we're writing a novel, I think that the choices that we make often are shaped by this imperfect understanding that we have.
Yeah. So the basic idea, persons are. I'm guessing here you're saying persons are not things. By things, we generally define something that is more precise, more concrete, more deterministic in its stance, whereas a person is not that. It is that. It's continuing changing.
The title of the paper is really a reference to a distinction that the philosopher Immanuel Kant makes. And Kant says that persons and things are really very different. He says that mere things, he says, are governed by laws of nature, that their behavior is determined by natural laws. Whereas he says persons, their behavior isn't determined by natural laws at all. What they do is they do things for reasons. They decide what to do. Now, there are a lot of difficult interpretive issues about what Kant really meant by this distinction, but it sounds to some people like he's talking about two very different kinds of things. And I think that's not true. I don't think that persons are very different from things. I think that we get to be persons by being things. We're human organisms, we have bodies, those follow all kinds of causal processes. down to the neurochemical level and are influenced in ways revealed by social and situational psychology, by our environments. But I do think that we're not just organisms. I think that part of why it feels like we're being brought down when somebody merely, somebody listens to your podcast and they're like, well, yeah, of course he'd ask that question because he was trained as an engineer. And you think, well, wait a minute, it was a good question. And you feel like they're not taking you seriously as soon as they think of your questions as the kind of thing that we can predict according to causal or statistical generalizations.
Yeah.
So I think that part of the reason we feel that way is that being a person is being an interpretive object. It's being this kind of organism under a particular kind of interpretation about which parts of your behavior are the ones that are worth engaging with and responding to and having answers to and admiring and respecting and being disappointed in and jealous of, and which parts of your behavior and the things that you say and the things that you think are the kinds of things that we should just overlook if we want to engage and talk to you. Yeah.
But from a sort of a biased engineering perspective, Mark, so you say, things obey natural laws. One could argue persons or organisms also behave natural laws in the components, right? There is nothing inside a human that does not behave, that does not obey laws of physics, right?
Absolutely.
Anything that shuttles around in your brain, any fluid that goes through your body, all of those obeys natural laws. Now, I think what we are saying is that given all of that, though, we don't have high predictability of what a human would do. Right?
We don't. But I think that in addition to the predictability, we want to do more than predict with each other. We want to decide what's worth responding to. So here's a helpful contrast. So people sometimes distinguish between being persuaded by somebody's argument. So they make a point and you're like, oh yeah. And they give you credit for convincing them. And changing your mind at the same time, being in a way that's prompted by hearing what somebody else says. So people sometimes complain about a kind of mansplaining where often a woman gives an argument to somebody and her interlocutor says, oh, here's a good idea. And they repeat back exactly what she just said as if he just thought of it himself.
Right.
And that's changing your mind in a way that's prompted by what somebody says, but it's not really being persuaded by them. And so the latter thing, I think, brings you down because it's not the kind of response you have to a person. It's the kind of response you could have to, the clouds looking like that argumentative text or anything that prompted the same thought. Whereas when we're convinced by somebody, there's something else that happens that we give them credit. And so I think that treating somebody as a person involves thinking of them in a particular kind of way. And this is just a metaphor perhaps, or a very loose analogy, but often when we have modeling understandings of many kinds of phenomena, models always work by excluding. There's always extra stuff that we could include and we exclude it. So when we're thinking about how a gas behaves using the ideal gas law, we're leaving out friction, we're leaving out that all kinds of particular information, the size of the particles, but that's information that's relevant for predicting some of the behavior. But the parts of the behavior of the gas that it predicts are the sort of ungassy aspects of the behavior, the things that make it less than ideally gassy. Right. I think the same. And so when we're thinking about it as a gas, that's that we leave out. And likewise, I think that when we're thinking about somebody as a person, we are making choices about what to leave out and what to leave in. And that particular way of making a choice about what to leave out and what to leave in and how we think about them is a kind of, you could think about it as analogous to a kind of modeling choice. And and it gives us a person-like understanding of somebody. It might not be the best predictive understanding of them, but it can still be very helpful to understand them as a person in that way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, Mark. So, there could be a cognitive cost to understanding, right? So, for me to transact with somebody else, the least cost position might be to consider that person a thing, right? So, the expectations are all fully defined, and I can just react to those expectations. Now, maybe there's a second best case, which is, the person is not a thing, but I have a set of boxes, a pre-designed boxes where I'm going to put that person into one of those boxes.
Mm-hmm.
And all the attributes of those boxes are well known, and I can react to it.
Yeah.
The cognitive cost for either one of these things are very low compared to me spending time.
Yeah.
And to understand that person, right?
Yeah.
And so this is what we see actually in the world, right? I don't think people spend that effort to. I mean, it is actually quite costly to think about it to really understand another individual.
No, I think it's right that we do resort to these kinds of shortcuts, but I also think that when somebody else does that with us, we do feel like we've been diminished in some way. That there is a more respectful way of thinking or relating to us that somebody has skipped or they've oversimplified.
Right.
And so I think that it is it's still tracking what this distinction is between when we feel like we've been treated like a person and when we feel like we've been diminished.
Has the idea of a person changed over time? So, if you go back to the inception of humans, or maybe just to older cultures, historical understanding, has the modern context set the person closer to a thing?
I think that it's a feature of the kind of optimism we have about the progress of science increasing over the last several centuries, that it is probably the case that more and more people feel like the aspects of personhood that are important are going to fit into this way that Kant thinks about things. But I think that Kant's observation that we do treat things and people in different ways is really important, and that we don't have to lose it just because we come to a scientific understanding of the way that we are realized. An analogy I find very helpful is just the analogy between persons and texts. So in the paper, I compare persons to works of philosophy, but I think the same thing works for novels or poems or any other text that's capable of being interpreted.
Yeah.
The text is all there. It's, some ink on a page, or it's pixels on a screen, or it's ones and zeros in the database. So everything about how the text is and how it functions and the way that the letters signify sounds and come together to be well syntactically formed sentences, that I think is all something that we can have our scientific understanding of. But then something does happen when we have a text like Hamlet, that there's an object of interpretation there. And we can feel like we come to understand that better over time as we come to have a better understanding of what's going on with it. And it might be that we don't all ultimately agree on what the best interpretation of it is.
Right.
But when we interpret it and think of what it's doing in that way, we get to engage with it in a whole different way that rises above the way we engage with it when we just see it as ones and zeros.
Mhm.
So that interpretive object arises out of the ones and zeros, but there's the interpretation itself adds something important.
Right. But isn't the style of interpretation is a function of the interpreter in some sense? Couldn't the interpretation reduce the person to ultimately a thing? In other words, I can imagine interpretation styles or sequences that after I interpret something, the amount of information coming out of that process is much, much smaller.
That's correct, but I think that we have to be specific about what kind of interpretation it is that interpretation of Hamlet is, or interpretation of a person is. And I think that the kind of interpretation that we're looking for when we interpret Hamlet or we interpret a text, philosophical text or person, is we're looking for ways of identifying what the contribution is of that person and what the background is. As I think about with persons, we try to distinguish, or what we need our interpretations to do is distinguish the protagonist from the predicament.
Yeah.
So sometimes maybe it is that being hangry is the predicament that somebody's in that they have to overcome as the protagonist. And sometimes being hangry as a response to their hunger is their character. It really is the protagonist.
So in the paper, Mark, you talk about sort of two types of interpretation, if I understand this correctly, sort of a causal interpretation and rational interpretation. How do you define those?
I'm not sure. I'm more confident that there's this distinction than how to think about either of them exactly. So if causal interpretation is what we're doing most of the time when we're taking the approach of science to understand how things are going to behave and what to expect of them, I think what's important about rational interpretation is that it's this kind of interpretive process where we decide which aspects we construct a story out of a life and figure out which aspects of that story are the places where the protagonist is active, and those are things that we need to respond to, and which places they're passive in the face of something, and it's really their predicament that they need to overcome. And so I think that one of our tools for doing that is that the places where we think of them as being passive, we treat what happens to them or what they do in the ordinary way that we think of other things. I call that causal in the paper, although I think sometimes we think statistically rather than causally. And I'm not trying to draw that contrast in the paper. But what's important about the rational interpretation is that we're classifying some things as part of the protagonist and some things as out as part of their predicament. And the protagonisty things we tend to ignore what we know if we know something about their exact causes.
Okay. And so the rational interpretation would be more holistic.
Yeah, I do think it's holistic. Now, this is a way in which my view contrasts with others. Other philosophers have drawn this distinction and thought that we could give a non-holistic view about what the difference is. And I just think that's hopeless. I think we need some more holistic way of drawing the distinction.
Is it teachable?
Is it teachable how to do this?
How to do it, yeah.
That's a very interesting question. It's not a question I'd thought about before. It seems like a pretty important question. If among the things that we are going to teach machines to do that persons do is to do this interpretation, we better know how that's going to go. And so I guess I don't know the answer to that question. I would take it that it must be, but I'm not sure how to do it.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I was thinking about it is that if I understand it correctly, the causal interpretation would be more, sort of systematic and process oriented. That can be delegated to computers. By the way, I don't think we are anywhere close to making a person analogous to a computer.
Yeah.
It's just fancy dreams. Especially because we can't really make computers interpret when information is absent or uncertain or generally not known. And so that, we haven't been able to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
I was asking teachable question more about more for people,
Yeah.
right? So could we actually teach a person who is maybe more prone to, let's say, causal interpretation, to move toward more rational interpretation? Or is it a skill that a person could acquire over time?
I think that there are differences between people in to what extent they apply these. But I'm inclined to think that the reason it looks like the difference in how they apply these is really because they're already engaged in rational interpretation. It's just that part of what rational interpretation lets you do is to count some stuff as not the stuff to be rationally interpreted. That's part of what we do when we rationally interpret people. We say, hey, I'm going to engage with what they said, but not their tone of voice. Or we listen to the words that somebody says, but not the tones. Almost we're trying to mimic their speech. So we look over stuff all the time. And so I tend to think that it's just something that people are always doing it. It's just that because there's this discretion in this process of interpretation to count more or less stuff as the protagonist, that there are differences between us about how much of that stuff we should count. And so I'm not sure if it's teaching or not. Maybe the people who are counting more as predicament are doing better than those of us who are counting more as protagonists.
So how do you sum up the essay, Mark?
This is a hard one. This is my least summable essay. I guess the answer is this. I think that what is to be a person like you or me, according to the hypothesis I defend in the paper, is that it's to be an interpretive object. It's to be the best version of yourself, the best story about where it is that you're free and active in your life and where it is that you're passive. And I feel like that is an optimistic way to think about ourselves, is that we really are the best version of ourselves, and giving us some charity, trying to give us the benefit of the doubt, is something that we deserve because that's part of who we are. That's the idea in the paper.
Right. Because anything else is unknown, right? So you could imagine something, but you'll be imagining both the conditions as well as the results of that, but it's not really knowable. And so in some ways, you only have one instance of yourself, and that's probably the best instance.
That feels good to find out that we're the best instance of ourselves. Yeah.
Excellent. We'll take a quick break, Mark, and when we come back, we talk about your other essay, Treating Like a Child.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. So we're back. Mark, you have another essay entitled Treating Like a Child. You say no one wants to be treated like a child. To be treated like a child offends our dignity. In many cases, it offends the dignity even of children. So this seems obvious. But what is the issue that you're really talking about here? Is it that some people treat children like children, but then they don't? It's not necessarily a good way to do it. But what exactly is the crux of the essay?
Yeah, so we have a concept of paternalism, which we think of as maybe illiberal states as having a paternalistic attitude towards their citizens, or we think of people as being inappropriately paternalistic if they take a real interest in what their neighbors are doing at home, where it's nobody else's business.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of liberal idea that it's bad when people are paternalistic to one another. And what the paper is really about is it's about trying to push back against a very common way of understanding what paternalism is, and with it pushing back on, I think, a misguided way of understanding what's wrong about paternalism. So the misguided idea is that treating somebody paternalistically is treating them like a child.
Yeah.
And what I want to say in the paper is that that's wrong. That actually, if we just take the etymology seriously, treating somebody paternalistically is treating them like you're their parent. That's what it is to treat somebody paternalistically. And so there's a kind of relationship that makes it appropriate to treat somebody paternalistically when you really are their parent, or you have a parent-like relationship to somebody.
Right.
And so it is when you don't have such a relationship that it's bad to treat them in those ways. Whereas on a more orthodox view, what's wrong about treating somebody paternalistically is that it's treating them as a child, and not everybody's a child. So, for example, on the orthodox view, once people are adults, it should never be appropriate to treat them paternalistically because they're just not children. Whereas, on my understanding, it's definitely going to be much less often okay to treat somebody paternalistically. But if there are some people who have relationships to others that are relevantly like the relationships of parents, then it might, in some limited cases, be okay for adults to treat each other paternalistically. And that's one of the upshots of the paper. Right.
So the term paternalistic treatment in itself, if I understand you correctly, should be put in context before we can say it's a good thing or not.
Yeah, I think we should all agree that not all paternalistic treatment is bad. When parents treat their children like children, including very young children, presumably that's okay. It's okay for me to, tell my 5-year-old, that he's not going to get dessert unless he finishes his asparagus. But it would be weird for me to show up for dinner at your house and tell you, the host, well, if you don't finish your asparagus, you're not going to get dessert, or offer some other, threat or a bribe. And not just because you're the host. If I did that to another guest, that wouldn't be appropriate either. And on the Orthodox view, we'd say that's because your other guest is not a child. But I would say it's not because they're not a child. It's because you're not their parent. It would also be inappropriate, I think, for me to show up at your house and tell the child of another guest that if they don't eat their asparagus, they're not going to get dessert. That's not my place because I'm not their parent. And so even though they're a child, it's not okay. We really need to have the right relationship with somebody to treat them in that way.
Right. So, I'm trying to abstract this just a little bit. So, if I were to do a thought experiment, Mark, let's say there is a child, there is a person who is acting paternalistically to the child. It doesn't have to be the parent, it may be somebody else. Let's say the child is playing video games, and the person talking to the child tells the child not to play video games and waste time. But let's say in the future, the world has only video games and nothing else.
Okay.
So that will be bad information. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the conventional notions that we say is the norm, is acceptable, is based on set of assumptions. When those assumptions change, in this case, the parent is in no position to give advice to the child because it doesn't know
yes,
video games.
it could be the parent is in a position to give advice because the parent's in a better position to know about the future than the child. It's just that they're wrong.
They're wrong.
So, yeah, it could still be that they are in a better position to guess about the future than the child because they have more relevant information about what the future might hold.
They may not.
But they might not. It might be that the child's acquaintance with video games puts them in a position to understand why it might turn out that everything will be video games in the future in a way that the parents couldn't appreciate because they don't know enough about video games.
So what I'm arguing, this is not necessarily in the paper, but I want to get your perspective on it. What I'm arguing is that in a regime where information is changing quite dramatically, the parent-to-child relationship that we expect from a societal norm is not necessarily, let me call it, not necessarily optimum. Because the parent might give the child direction, advice, and all of them would be wrong because the parent doesn't have sufficient information or has less information than the child.
So I think that my account that I give ultimately in the paper can explain why that would be and can resonate with your idea that under certain circumstances, the appropriate scope for paternalism could on the part of parents could shift. So let me say a little bit about how my positive view in the paper works in order to say why I think it applies. So what I say in the paper is that objectionable paternalism, the kind that's treating somebody in a way that is not appropriate, happens when you think you know what's best for somebody, but you try to constrain what they do or influence what they do to be better for them. In a way that interferes with their autonomy.
Right.
And autonomy, I think, is just self-governance. That's what it means to be autonomous. It means to govern yourself. So if autonomy is self-governance, then I think that sometimes we could influence what somebody does, but not interfere with their autonomy if part of what we do is we influence who they are. So because parents typically, especially of very young children, are in a position to have an extended long-term relationship with their children, they're in a position to believe that they will help to grow their child into being the kind of person who will look back on this particular event and be glad that their parent encouraged them to eat their vegetables. And if that's true, then by encouraging the child to eat their vegetables, we haven't interfered with their autonomy. What we've done is we've helped them become the kind of person who would like to have overcome their childish distaste for vegetables in order to be healthy. So that's kind of the model, is that when somebody has an extended long-term relationship with somebody that's going to help to shape who they are, you can do these kinds of things. And that comes in degrees. Right. So there's no on or off point. And it can be affected by environmental and cultural factors. It could be, for example, that in some parts of the world, people live under their parents' roofs a decade longer or 2 decades longer than other parts of the world. And we would expect that in those parts of the world, there's more room for the parents to influence their children. And so I would expect that in those parts of the world, it'll be more reasonable for parents to be paternalistic about more things as their child is older. Whereas in cultures in which it's normal to leave home at a younger age and for parents to have less of a say or influence, it's going to be less appropriate for parents to have influence at that earlier stage. Yeah. And again, I think if we have the kind of case where you were describing, where the world is changing,
right?
When the world's changing in that way, it's going to be less appropriate for parents to guess that their child will be successfully shaped in some particular way. And so, again, I think that's the kind of thing that could, in principle, make a difference.
Yeah. So, your vegetable example, the presumption is that vegetables are good for you. And that assumption could be wrong, right? And so the parent is using it as a heuristic because he or she has learned that as truth in the past. But it is not true, let's say, right? So you'll be using a heuristic that's already expired in a way to influence the child. So that is where I think the issue, in some sense happens. If you look at into cultures, more ancient cultures around the world, there's sort of an ancestor worship problem in those cultures. And the assumption is that the ancestors knew a lot of things. It's an assumption. An assumption. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I think that you are latching onto something a little bit different from what I was most worried about in the paper. But I think that the need to respect the wisdom of the past is something that we want to be cautious about how we apply it as the world changes.
Right.
My own view is that we can sometimes be too incautious about throwing it out. But as the world changes, certainly stuff that was really well reinforced by evolution and by culture and by experience is stuff that in principle could be totally irrelevant in the contemporary world. And to the extent that parents are passing on that, I think that sometimes they're making mistakes. I think that's right.
Yeah. And so there may be an alternative, which is the way that I think, if I understand this correctly, Mark, the parent to child relationship doesn't take a lot of feedbacks in the conventional way. It's one-way traffic, so to speak. But if the parent really understands that he or she does not have full information, then that relationship becomes sort of two-way traffic. And so both people can take advantage of information that other has, provided both are open to new information coming to them.
That's right. And in the earlier part of our discussion today, we were talking about ways in which we sometimes bring people down or write them off by treating, what they say as not really coming, or what they do as not really being them, but as that being their environment.
Yeah.
One way that we can get into trouble is when we do that, not just to somebody snapping at you or somebody doing something, but rather to what they say. So if I'm the parent and I've decided that I want to raise my children to resist clever marketing strategies and not be, ignore ad campaigns and product rollouts and try to be a good consumer. And I have a child who's really interested in technology, and they spend all their time, watching YouTube videos of the CEOs of tech companies revealing their new products. They might have all kinds of information that I might not treat as information, because even though I recognize that they have information about tech products, I see them as sharing that information with me only because they've been influenced by these clever marketing strategies that I want them to stop being influenced by. And so I ignore them. And I think that we can do that to each other. We can have information for each other, and we can recognize that we have information for each other, and we can ignore each other even so. And if that happens, then it's not going to work this way, where the parents will get this new information from their children. Parents sometimes overlook it or treat their children like they don't have something to share. And that can be a way that we don't succeed at this.
Right. And, in a larger context, you can take this to societies, you can take this to organizations where you have sort of a hierarchical structure, and the paternal child relationship is playing out in all of those systems. Hierarchy, in some sense, is a way to enforce this type of relationship. The person on top of the pyramid feels obligated to develop, quote unquote, the basement, without understanding that the basement actually could have more information than the top of the pyramid in complex systems like companies or societies.
That seems right to me.
And so if we go back to the paper, you talk about autonomy and selves. So how do you sort of, again, summarize the idea?
I think that the idea of the paper is really just that paternalism is about acting in ways that are licensed by the relationship you have with somebody. And that if you want to try to benefit somebody in ways that they don't seem to want, then you'd better be committed to having the kind of relationship with them that will make them appreciate it. And if you're not, if you're just going to pass somebody on the street and judge what's right for them, then I think it's inappropriate for you to be paternalistic in that way. And so when we try to influence each other for the better, that's a kind of exercise of power. And I think that kind of power only comes with responsibility.
Right. Yeah, so to exercise power that way, sort of do it and walk away, is actually less costly for the one who's exercising it. But what you're saying is that if you do that, bunch of other things that need to follow through with that.
Yeah, you need to be committed.
Right. So it's not a transaction. It's ultimately, as you say, you are entering into a relationship.
That's right.
That has more, yeah. And so in conclusion then, Mark, so how do you, going back to what we were discussing before, how do you put these ideas, how we interact with other people, how do we interpret them? And in this is a specific instance of an interaction between a parent and a child, or somebody who is acting paternal to somebody else. How do you think all of these things are changing in the modern context? Or are they changing at all? It just feels like they're changing.
That's a really good question. I think they're not fundamentally changing, but I do think that that part of how we interpret each other is shaped by the reactions that each other have to other things that we're also interpreting. And so I think that one of the things that can happen even between parent and child is that part of how we don't just understand each other directly based on our own direct experiences of each other, but we see how each other reacts to things like the rise of Donald Trump. There are really salient shared experiences, and we start to see each other as on sides of those things. When we learn that somebody voted for Donald Trump, or we learn that they did not vote for Donald Trump, they voted for somebody else, we feel like that tells us something about them because we think we know something about the thing they're reacting to. And I think that part of what's really dangerous about this is that we're used to having things that we have a shared understanding of. And when we understand something the same way and we both like it, then we understand a lot about each other. There's a lot about each other to like. And when we understand it in the same way and we have opposite reactions to it, I like it and you hate it, then we understand a lot about each other. We understand that we're very different. But if we try to triangulate on that way, but we don't really have the same interpretation of the thing we're triangulating on, then that can lead us to be even more mistaken in our interpretations of each other than we would be otherwise. So if we're not perfect at interpreting things, and each of us have very different interpretations of the thing we're triangulating on, I think that can really make it harder. And that's one of the things that I think is happening and over the last few years, and is one of the things I think that's going on with political polarization, both at large and, as many of us know, in our families, as we find that we have deep disagreements with our parents or our children or our siblings about politics. And I think that this sort of the way that the attention economy sort of seizes up a small number of things to be the things that everybody's reacting to, together with the fact that different people still see different kinds of things about that thing, can really be a recipe for making this harder for us.
Yeah, that's really interesting way to think about it. So, I would think about every observation, every transaction that you're interpreting. There are some errors. There is no perfect interpretation. And as you file away that information with errors, they tend to be self-reinforcing.
Yeah.
And so there is really no way. So once you go down a track in terms of, collecting and interpreting information on another individual, let's say, that is sort of a one-way process. You never really turn back on that process, because every piece of new information either going to be self-reinforcing or you're going to discard it completely.
That's right. And it could be that part of the ways that we're socially organized can make it harder. If we're stuck in smaller communities with the same people, sometimes as each of our relationships have other people who know both of us, that can be a way to set us back on track. But when it gets easier and easier to abandon relationships and start new ones, and we have fewer and fewer common parties who know each of us, I think that can reinforce this phenomenon as well.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah, this has been great, Mark. Thanks so much for spending time.
Thank you so much. This was really fun. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.